Hey folks, Mr. Howard back with some more world building sort of tips and helpful stuff. This should be a relatively short video, with your assignment at the end of it, and then I'll write your assignment as well and put it in there. So this is for creative writing 1 and 2. For the world building you're doing for sci-fi and or fantasy. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of the factions or societies or races or what have you that you're going to have going on in your world. So you made maps last time. You thought about, the maps. In order to think about the maps, you have to think a little bit about the factions and the societies and stuff like that. But now we're going to sort of lay those out and do a little bit of history work on that. So, who has the power in your world? Where does the power come from? Is it financial? Is it magical? Is there something else that's going on? Who wants the power but doesn't have it? What races or groups exist in the world, and what is their ideology? What makes them function? How do their societies structured? So in order to do this, you're going to have to keep an eye on things like history, economics, and religion, because all of these things are connected. If you look at the history of the United States, we've got the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. We've got all the World War I, World War II. We got all those sorts of global big things going on. But we also have slavery and the civil rights movement and, the suffrage movement and all kinds of things that go on within the country itself. But like I said, you've got 3 levels. So if you're trying to build a believable world, you have to have that global level where you have those major big events. But within those big events, you have the state level and the local level as well. So, if you're looking at the state level, you could look at Virginia. I mean, we have a part to play in all of the events listed there, from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War and the World Wars to slavery and the Civil Rights Movement and women's suffrage and all of that. You could look at the role that Virginia has and the factions within Virginia. What groups have power? What groups want to have power? How do the various races and groups interact? I mean, we're talking about real history here, but then you got to go down to the local level. Think about your town. Did any battles in the Civil War happen in your town, in the Revolutionary War? What kind of a history goes into that? So we got to think about the history that goes on those 3 levels and sort of use that to explain the factions and the societies and how they interact. Then you got to think about economics. I mean, economics is a big deal. We live in a capitalist country, so economics is a huge deal. The United States might be doing pretty well as a country itself. That's great. Virginia might be doing pretty well as a state, but within the state of Virginia, individual towns are prosperous and individual towns are not prosperous. I grew up in Vermont. It's part of the United States too, but it's very, very different from Virginia. And in Vermont, tourist towns, they're doing very, very well. But old factory towns are not. The population is aging and dying, and there's no income, and things are really bad. So depending on what your local situation is, it can be very, very different. So you're working on those 3 levels. And you can look at history, you can look at economics. You also want to look at religion. It's another thing that makes the world what it is today. What different groups or factions are there in terms of religion? Different races can have different factions, religious factions. What do they believe? Why do they believe it? If you like writing mythologies, now's your chance to do some of that stuff. So let's populate this world, but let's populate all 3 levels of this world with some believable peoples, with backstories and some of that stuff. So let's talk examples. Let me give you a couple of examples to sort of make this real to you. Maybe you've read Ender's Game. What do the 3 worlds look like in Ender's Game? How do we have these 3 levels? Well, on the global level, the interplanetary level, if you will, we have 2 factions. One of the factions is humanity, and the other faction is the buggers, these insectoid aliens who are going to come and destroy everyone. And the story is the story of the struggle between these 2 factions and which one is going to win, which one's going to have dominance over the universe and sort of enslave or destroy the other. But hold on. There's a second level of that. We focus in just on the planet Earth. When we read about Peter and Valentine, Demosthenes, and Locke. Now, if you haven't read Ender's Game, I'm sorry, but it just seems like a book that a lot of you read probably. We've got East versus West. It's very much Soviets versus capitalists, the United States and their allies versus the Russians and their allies, that's going on. So even though humanity is united against the buggers, within Earth they're divided. So we have this secondary level where we have people struggling for power. But hold up, literally everything in Ender's Game happens at the local level. What's the local level? It's battle school. There are armies. What are the factions there? Well, they're the various armies, Rat Army or Snake Army or Dragon Army. Who are the local figures that are in charge? Well, it's Colonel Graff, but it's all the various army commanders. And so you end up with multiple levels functioning together, all stacked, and the book works and makes sense because of that. But remember, literally everything happens to Ender on a local level. So that's the really important one. But in order for that local level to make sense, it's got to be in a matrix involving some of that higher stuff. So let's look at a fantasy book that we can do. Harry Potter, okay? Any Harry Potter book is fine. We have a global level. That involves the Ministry of Magic versus the Death Eaters. Those are your two primary factors. The Order of the Phoenix would fall in there too. They're struggling for this like whole world situation against Voldemort. Then you've got the state level. The state level, if you will, is Hogwarts. We've got this big old school. It's got 4 houses. Those are your factions: Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw. Dumbledore is the leader of the overall school. Each house has a head of house and prefects and stuff like that. And then you move down to the local level. The local level is Ron, Harry, Hermione, and their interactions with the classmates in their year. There are 7 years of kids at Hogwarts. We don't really run into other ones very much at all. It's almost entirely their year and the classes they go to and their professors. And the students from that, and Gryffindor Tower in particular, and who's the prefect of that. So you can sort of separate Harry Potter, and you can see how these levels interact. Yes, Harry does interact with things on a global level and on a state level more than Ender does. Although Ender always is, he just doesn't really realize it. One last example, and then I'll cast you off to start inventing and populating. The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, almost everybody's seen the movies if they haven't read the book. We've got this global level. We got this country called Pan Am. It's got a capital and 12 districts, and there's all this politics and stuff going on between them, and a history of this war and this rebellion. District 13 was destroyed. All of that stuff is your global level history. Then we get down to the state level, which is District 12. That's where Katniss is from. And then you get down to the local level, and the local level sort of shifts. It starts out in the seam where she lives, and then it moves to sort of the training center where she trains with the other tributes, and then the final local level, if you will, is the Hunger Games themselves. So one thing to think about is your local levels will shift as your story goes on, but you don't want them to shift too much. It becomes too much for the reader. So my suggestion as you sort of plot or plan your story is to think about a 3-act or a 5-act model. That there should be 3 major locations or 5 major locations at tops where things take place, 5 local levels to plan. And they all fit into the overarching matrices of the state and global levels. So again, just to recap, I'm sending you off this week to start thinking about the factions, the societies, the groups that populate your various worlds. You're going to think about those 3 levels, and as you think about those 3 levels, you're going to think about the history, the economics, the religions that impact these societies and how they all interplay, and try and make a consistent, believable fantasy world, whether it's a space fantasy world or a sci-fi world, or a high fantasy or cyberpunk or whatever it happens to be, or even a parallel world that goes along with us. So get planning, get thinking, and send me some stuff. I'd love to read it. Thanks.